Hello, dear friends. We are going to do a discussion of Michel Foucault's theories. This video is part of the New Historicism video series. You must have already watched the first one. As I have already explained in the first video, New Historicism is heavily dependent on Foucauldian theories. Every one of us has struggled at some point with Michel Foucault. Foucault's theories are very difficult to understand and teach because there is nothing called Foucault's theory. Foucault himself did not explain many of the things that are part of Foucauldian theory. It was his commentators who explained. He just brought forth ideas and concepts, and he did not fall into any movement or category easily. That is Michel Foucault. Foucault deliberately stood outside the canon of literary theory and philosophy. And he refused to fix his concepts or define his concepts in easy ways. So much more difficult for us. Now, Foucault stood against traditional theory also. He criticized Derrida and such theoreticians, and he advocated the approach called archaeology to history. At first, he talked about archaeology, and then eventually he revised it and developed the concept of genealogy. We will talk about that now. At first, it was in the early 1970s that he advocated what is called archaeology. The early 1970s. Well, you know that traditional historians pretend that history is a unified entity. Traditional historians believe that history is unified. It is one homogeneous story. There are no fissures or gaps in history. If there are any gaps or things that we don't know or understand, the traditional historian will cover it up with the story of history. What the traditional historians did was take evidence from history. Evidence. Historical evidence like books or people's documents or monuments or artifacts from the past. All these documents is actual historical evidence that they took and studied. Inevitably, these documents did not present a unified story. Inevitably, there were gaps and fissures. Everything, all the documents did not fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. There were many gaps, like the gaps on a bookshelf. These gaps, the old historians did not focus on. They ignored it. They did not understand these gaps. And when they studied the documents of history, they ignored these gaps. And what did they do? They threw over these documents the blanket of history, covering these gaps. And it looked like there are no gaps or fissures. It looked like history is unified. Did you understand? Traditional history or old historians presented one story of history as if it really happened, covering up all the inconsistencies and gaps. The story of history they made, it was not real. It was partly fiction. This story of history they made and put over the documents. They covered up the documents so that it looked like there is no discontinuity in history. It looked like there are no gaps, there is no discontinuity, there are no fissures. There are no silences. It looked like history is one continuous story. Our Michel Foucault is against this idea. Michel Foucault does not support the idea that history is continuous and homogeneous. Foucault believes that history has gaps. Foucault focuses on the gaps. And he believes in history as archive. And what do you mean by that? History as archive. For easy understanding, I can say this is a very famous example. History is like the book stacks in a library. In a library stack, there will be many missing books. There will be many spaces in between. It won't be a continuous array of books always. That you can see in this picture. Isn't it like that? History is also full of discontinuities and gaps. Foucault's archival approach to history gave importance to the gaps and discontinuities. You should rediscover the struggles of the past. These gaps are the struggles of the past. You should rediscover the struggles of the past. You should highlight the struggles, the gaps, the silences, the omissions of history. You should not fill up these gaps with fiction. You should not put over them the blanket of history. So, Foucault's approach to history, which New Historicism borrowed, is actually questioning old historicism. It is questioning Foucauldian approach, and New Historicism is questioning old historicism, and New Historicism is anti-establishment. We can say Foucauldian approach to history goes against the overarching meta-narratives of history. The blanket of history is the meta-narrative of history. New Historicism is against it. Foucault is against it. Foucault goes against the overarching meta-narratives of history. It goes against the ways in which power works on history and makes a grand narrative out of it. The powerful people will come and fill the gaps with fiction. They will create one story of history that suits their purpose. New Historicism does not like that. As you know, many of Foucault's ideas, like the panoptic surveillance state, or discourse, or episteme, or power knowledge, etc., are all very important in understanding the Foucauldian approach to history. I will discuss all these terms, don't worry. Panoptic surveillance state, discourse, episteme, power knowledge, everything I will discuss. These are all ways in which Foucault questioned old kinds of history. Foucault questioned old kinds of history, and he questioned the old perceptions of criminality, psychiatry, sexuality, etc., that followed the old historicist approach. Foucault questioned the old historicist approach to discourses like sexuality, criminality, psychiatry. Is that clear? Now, a very important concept of Foucault is that of discourse. I guess everybody knows that. Don't worry, I will explain. Discourse is related to power knowledge. A very important concept in Foucault is discourse as well as power knowledge. How power knowledge becomes a discourse. Power bar knowledge. That is how Foucault wrote it. Foucault talked about how power works in the society. How power works on subjects in the society. Now, Foucault is against the idea. He questioned the idea, the age-old idea. What idea? That power works from the top to the bottom. Foucault questioned the idea that power always works from top to the bottom. Here, in Foucault, power is everywhere. Foucault said that in a society, power is everywhere. It works in capillary modes, like our blood vessels and capillaries. It works in capillary modes or capillary formations. The lower strata also exert power. The powerless people also exert power. Power is everywhere. For example, look at a family. It is not only the father exerting power on the mother and the children, but in some ways the mother exerts power. In other ways, children exert power. Very subtly sometimes, very indirectly sometimes, but power is there everywhere in the structure. Power is ubiquitous. Power is ubiquitous, means everywhere. It is found everywhere. It is something that reaches the very grain of individuals. Hello, you have power. Just realize it. It's within you. Power is within you. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. You can't say I am powerless. You can't say I am a victim. Because even the victim exerts a certain kind of power, the power of resistance upon the oppressor. Even the powerless people have some kind of power, though they should realize it and exert it. It is that everybody has some power. We have to realize it, and we have to see how power reaches into the very grain of our individual minds and inserts it into all our actions. There is nothing that escapes power relationships. Power constitutes subjects. It establishes institutions and controls subjects. Religion, education, law, gender, fashion, everything controls us. Power produces forms of knowledge, and knowledge in turn modifies, redistributes, and stabilizes categories of power. See, this beautiful image I got from the internet. So, power defines us. Power is there in the very grain of individuals. It's like ideology. Like power, Foucauldian power, Althusserian concept of ideology is all pervasive. Ideology also defines us. Power is there in our knowledge systems, in our learning processes. It is there in our politics. It is there in our education, all the institutions of the society. It is there in our daily lives. You know, that is why cultural studies is all about popular culture and daily life, because there is a lot of power at work there. Both oppressive power as well as subversive power. Resistance power, subversive power, that's also power. So, power, knowledge, it exists together. It constitutes subjects. It establishes institutions, controls. Knowledge redefines, modifies, redistributes power. Power in turn produces knowledge. Power and knowledge go hand in hand. It's everywhere. Now, this is related to Foucault's concept of history as archive. History as archive means what? History is like the book stacks in a library. History is discontinuous. This kind of history as archival or discontinuous is where power works hand in hand with knowledge. In his discussions of sexuality, for example, in the book History of Sexuality, you must have heard of that. Foucault, in the History of Sexuality, talks about sexuality. In his discussions on sexuality, in his discussions on criminality, in which book? Discipline and Punish. Criminality and Punishment. And also in the other book, The Order of Things. In these books, Foucault discussed power not as a dividing power or a dividing practice, as dividing powerful people from the powerless people. No. But that is not how he talked about power. But he moved towards a more positive conception of power. Power is not dividing. Power is not dividing the powerful people on top, powerless people on the bottom. Not like that. Power is more positive. It is productive. Foucault understood power as positive and productive. It is there in all of us. It produces our identities. It produces us. Power is a hybrid form containing within it aspects of pleasure, aspects of knowledge, aspects of action and subversion, and so on and so forth. Power produces pleasure, knowledge, action and subversion. With that background knowledge of power knowledge, let me now explain the concept of archaeology. The term archaeology appeared in many of the early books of Foucault. The term archaeology appeared in many of the early books of Foucault, such as The Birth of the Clinic. First, actually, he wrote Order of Things. The Order of Things, an Archaeology of the Human Sciences. It came in 1970. Remember that year. And then The Birth of the Clinic, an Archaeology of Medical Perception. 3 years later, in 1973. So he is using archaeology in all the titles. Why? Archaeology was a very pet idea that Foucault used in many of his early titles. What was archaeology? Archaeology for Foucault was his term to denote the research and analysis of history. The research and analysis of history. By digging into the past, uncovering the discursive elements of the past. Foucault talked about history, the discursive elements of history of the past, through the word archaeology, the discontinuous elements of the past, all the conflictual, fragmented elements of the past. These fragmented elements of the past became the documents for the old historian, isn't it? The fragmented elements of the past, the discontinuous elements of the past, became the documents which the historians work on. What do the historians do? They look at these documents or evidence from the past. These are discontinuous, fragmented. The historians rearrange them, work with them, not in any hierarchical manner, but in a structural manner. What does the Foucauldian historian do? He does not throw over these documents of history, a story of history, a homogeneous blanket of history. He does not use. Then what does he do? Without a hierarchical manner, he just looks at the documents in a structural manner, focusing on the documents themselves rather than create an overarching story out of it. The Foucauldian historian focuses on the documents, the discontinuities of the documents. He does not hide the gaps and discontinuities under a homogeneous story. Whereas the old historians covered up the gaps. The Foucauldian historian studies these documents structurally, organizing the documents, organizing the evidence of history, dividing them up, reorganizing them, defining unities and relations in these documents. That is what he does. Defining them, dividing them, reorganizing them, and thus history becomes discontinuous. It becomes evolving, becoming. There is no finished product in Foucauldian history. Foucault was thus advocating a very new approach to the evidence of history, to the documents of history. Foucault was advocating a totally new approach to the documents of history. Foucauldian conception of history is that it is discontinuous, no longer something that the historian has to explain and unify. Thus, discontinuity becomes a positive element. These gaps or discontinuities become a positive element in Foucault, where history's objectives are found and validated. It is in these discontinuities that history's objectives are found. It is not in the homogeneous story that the old historians made up. History becomes a discourse. History becomes a whole way of talking about something. History becomes an institutionalized way of thinking. The discourse of history is formed only when we focus on the discontinuities. When history is a discourse, it has its own language, it has its own perspectives, and that discourse defines you. You can't escape it, you exist within it. And what is the peculiarity of discourse? It is never unified. It is always fragmented. Did you understand? Now, to explain the concept of discourse, there are so many examples we can give. Like sexuality. Sexuality is a discourse. It is not one unified story. It is a discontinuous set of documents. Or psychiatry. Or criminality. Or terrorism, nationalism, gender. Any number of examples we can give. These are all discourses. They are discontinuous. They are not meta-narratives. They are all discontinuous elements or entities which become a way of thinking. These discourses procure its own language. They have a certain language associated with them. These discourses get institutionalized very easily. That is the problem with discourse. Discourse is discontinuous, fragmented, but easily they will get institutionalized because it is a way of thinking, a way of speaking. A discourse procures its own language. A discourse is a system of thought. A discourse is a system of thought composed of ideas, attitudes, causes of action. A discourse will have its own ideas, its own ways of thinking, its own attitudes, its own causes of action, beliefs and practices. It's like a world in itself. Discourse is a system of thought composed of ideas. Think of nationalism, for example. When you are within the discourse of nationalism, that discourse defines what you think about India. You are not free to think whatever you want. The discourse of nationalism defines what you should think about India, what you should think about the national language Hindi. It defines what you should think about Hindus and Muslims, what you think about religion, and so on and so forth. Nationalism defines you. It defines your way of thinking. It gives you a language. Nationalism as a discourse is composed of ideas, attitudes. Are you following me? Nationalism as a discourse contains its own ideas, attitudes, causes of action. And what happens? Anybody who thinks against these ideas or attitudes of nationalism become an anti-national. That is how every discourse works. And even if you are a nationalist, let me tell you this. Even if you are a nationalist, that does not mean you should completely accept what the ruling party says. Or it does not mean that you should completely accept certain communities are as great. You need not completely accept that certain communities are bad. Why? Even though nationalism gives you one language, you need not accept. Why? Because nationalism is not one homogeneous thing. Nationalism within itself, within the discourse of nationalism, it is diverse. It is fragmented, very multiple, very plural. Foucault is showing how discourses are fragmented and diverse and multiple, but they become oppressive. That is what Foucault is showing. Even though discourses are by nature fragmented and multiple and plural, discourses become oppressive. Discourses eventually silence us. It deny us freedom. Discourses deny us freedom. Discourses wipe out the plurality. It works against itself. So, Foucault points out that we should continually question discourses. Discourses should be continually questioned. A discourse is so comprehensive that everything outside the discourse becomes meaningless and negative. A discourse has that power of negating everything that is outside it. These are all examples. Now, what makes knowledge? Knowledge. It is the episteme. It was in the book The Order of Things that Foucault talked about the episteme, and he made an epistemological study of discourses. Foucault talked about the episteme and made an epistemological study of discourses. Remember, in The Order of Things, published in 1970. He studied epistemologically about biology or life, about economics or labor, about linguistics or language. Did you understand? In The Order of Things, he studied biology, which is actually life, study of life. He studied economics, which is actually study of labor. He studied linguistics, which is the study of language. And Foucault also looked at how in the Renaissance period, and after that in the classical period, and in the modern period, first Renaissance period, then what we call neoclassical period, then the modern period. In these periods, what happened? These ideas changed drastically. Which ideas? Biology, economics, language, or linguistics. Life it was at first. Later it became biology. Language it was at first. Later it became linguistics. Labor it was at first. Later it became economics. How did these changes happen? Because of what is called episteme. Clear? Now what is an episteme? Before I come to this, what is an episteme? Episteme is the a priori of knowledge. Have you heard of a priori? It's a very common word in philosophy from Immanuel Kant. A priori means a preconceived idea. Episteme is the a priori of knowledge. That means episteme is the preconceived idea that we have in our mind that makes us accept some things as knowledge. Did you understand? We accept certain things as knowledge and certain things as not knowledge. Why? Because we have an episteme in our mind. I think you didn't get it. Let me give you a silly example. Suppose there is a boy who wants to get married and he meets this girl. One girl and one boy. They start talking to get to know each other. The boy asks the girl, "What do you do?" And the girl says, "I'm learning to fold clothes." The boy asks the girl, "What do you do?" And the girl says, "I'm learning to fold clothes." What? That is not knowledge. The boy is confused. Then he says, "Oh, are you in the hospitality industry? Because in hotels, etc., you should know how to fold clothes, right? Do you work in a hotel? Or are you doing a hospitality course? Probably MBA in hospitality?" The girl says, "No, I am at home, just learning to fold clothes." Array, something is seriously wrong. We think this is not normal. Why? Because folding clothes outside the hospitality industry is not considered a knowledge these days, isn't it? It is not considered a knowledge. Why are certain things considered knowledge and why is folding clothes not considered knowledge? Because of the a priori of understanding, the preconceived notions of knowledge called episteme. Did you understand? Folding clothes is not knowledge, whereas other household things like cooking, probably may be considered knowledge. My passion is cooking and I'm learning cooking sounds more acceptable than my passion is folding clothes or washing clothes. These days, if somebody specializes in washing clothes, except if he or she is in the laundry industry, you think there is something wrong because you don't need them to do that. Because washing clothes is not knowledge anymore. Why? Because you can just buy a washing machine. That's why. So, like that, in every period, there are certain things accepted as knowledge. Did you understand? To explain this, a very famous example is Jorge Luis Borges. Jorge Luis Borges, can you see? He he wrote about a fictitious taxonomy of animals. He described a fictitious taxonomy of animals in his 1942 essay, The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. Here, he's talking about a Chinese encyclopedia called Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. In this encyclopedia, animals are classified in weird ways. Animals are classified like this. Those belonging to the emperor. Okay. Embalmed animals. They are not even animals because they should be dead. Next is trained animals. Suckling pigs. Wow, that is another category. Mermaids. That is not an animal. Fabled animals. That means what? Animals about whom there are fables. Now, you can't accept that. Another category is stray dogs. What? Is this a scientific classification? This looks so stupid. Those included in this classification, that is another category. Funny. Those that tremble as if they were mad. Oh my God, something is seriously wrong with this encyclopedia. Innumerable ones. Those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush. Come on. This is a joke. Etc. Oh, that is also a category. Those that have just broken the vase. Wow. Those that from afar look like flies. What kind of crazy guy made this category, you are wondering. This encyclopedia, Chinese encyclopedia that Borges talked about, is the most famous Heterotropia that appears in Foucault's work. Heterotropia. What is a heterotropia? It's a many-layered space. A space that has many layers of meanings. A space that has many layers of relationships. A heterotropia is a space where epistemes overlap and clash. Knowledges or a priori of knowledges overlap and clash in a heterotropia. What is meant by episteme? Episteme means study of knowledge. Epistemology means study of knowledge or history of knowledge. And knowledges clash in heterotropia, creating layers of meanings and relationships. Clear? This is a heterotropia, where many knowledges clash, where many epistemes clash. Foucault, in the order of things, studies knowledges. I mentioned this already. Knowledges of the Renaissance period, classical period, and modern period. He studied Renaissance and found that the Renaissance period categorized knowledge based on resemblance. In the Renaissance period, knowledge is organized around resemblance, similarity or resemblance. In the classical period, there is representation and categorization instead. In the classical period, there is representation and categorization. And that gave rise to science. When you start to represent and categorize, it becomes science. In the Renaissance period, literature, for example, is based on life or similarity or life-likeness. Literature here is very close to life. However, in the classical period or neoclassical period, they begin to categorize scientifically. They begin to categorize knowledges, literature, etc. scientifically. At this time, taxonomy developed, representation developed, a scientific language developed. It is not based on resemblance. During the classical period, in France and England, I mean the neoclassical period, the 17th and 18th centuries, some social classes are represented in a certain way. Some people are represented in a certain way. English culture is represented in a certain way as the culture of the true-born Englishman, while French culture is represented in a certain other way as very negative. Categorization. You can see that in Gulliver's Travels, for example. Categorization, that is the basis of science. In the modern episteme, the centrality is on man. What is man like? Who is man? What are the many ways in which man engages in society and culture? Are you following me? Modernity focuses on man. Late 19th, 20th centuries. In the Renaissance episteme, what was categorized as life took the form of natural history in the neoclassical episteme, and in the modern period it became the science of biology. The science of biology had its roots in the natural history of the neoclassical period. Similarly, in the case of labor, what was considered labor in the neoclassical episteme became what is the science of wealth. In the what was considered labor in the Renaissance episteme became the science of wealth in the neoclassical episteme. And today, in the modern period, it is economics, the science of economics. Today, the word income is more acceptable than wealth, isn't it? If somebody says, I have a pretty good income, you appreciate him. If somebody says, I'm pretty wealthy, you will think, what? What a boastful bloke, you will think. Economics is acceptable. And income is acceptable. In the case of language, what was in the Renaissance episteme language, in the neoclassical episteme became general principles of grammar. In the 18th century, language was given up and the concept of grammar took over. In the modern episteme, it became the advanced science of linguistics. Did you understand? Now look at this. The structural patterns that link the aspects of life. The structural patterns that link the aspects of life in the modern period. In order to understand biology, we need a synchronic study. We need to study all the animals and birds that exist at this time. We don't need a diachronic study. Synchronic similarities. Similarities of animals that exist at this particular period. Synchronic similarities in the discipline become more important and more apparent than diachronic similarities. You will understand with linguistics. You study language as it exists today. History is there. Diachronics is important, but synchronics is more important. Studying contemporary animals is more important than studying ancient animals. Foucault pointed out that synchronic associations are important in all these sciences. In economics, biology, linguistics, we talk synchronically. Now, Foucault's understanding of history is almost always related to the history of the present. Foucault's understanding of history is associated with what is called the history of the present. The effective history of the present. That is how it is called. The effective history of the present. What does that denote? The erratic and discontinuous process by which the present became the present. Foucault, by the history of the present, refers to the erratic and discontinuous process. Remember, history as archive. the discontinuous process by which the present became the present. See, history of the present does not mean how the present developed from the past. That is diachronic approach. History of the present does not mean how the present developed from the past. Rather, it means how the present developed from discontinuous processes. He talks about how discourses came into being, not in a diachronic manner, but in a synchronic manner. How the present discourses came into being, how the present discourse of sexuality came into being, how the present discourse of psychiatry came into being, how present criminality came into being. They are all based on synchronic epistemological connections. They are not based on history of the past. They are based on epistemological present connections. The development of the history of the present is related to Foucault's terms archaeology and genealogy. These are two important terms, archaeology and genealogy. Foucault's Discipline and Punish is the book that marked his development from archaeology to genealogy. In Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he developed archaeology into genealogy. Before that, he was talking only about archaeology. If archaeology is about how a discourse is developed or created, genealogy is about how the human being is created within that discourse. If archaeology is about how a discourse is developed or created, genealogy is about how a human being is created within that discourse. Did you understand? Archaeology defines how a discourse is created. Genealogy discusses how a human being is created within the discourse or within a network of power relations. Genealogy works with almost the same things as archaeology. But let me explain. Archaeology defines how a discourse is created, a whole discourse is created, while here it is about how a human being is created. How a human being is always positioned within a network of power relations. How a human being is constructed entirely because of this network of power relations. If you examine your own life, you'll understand. You're not an independent, autonomous being, are you? You're completely controlled by the country, the religion, the gender that you belong to. You're completely controlled by your family, economics, and other power relations, political relations that you exist in, isn't it? You are in a network of power relations. That is why Rousseau said, man is born free, but always he is in chains. Because of this network of relations. And Foucault, when he understood more about the network of relations, he moved from a historical or diachronic understanding towards a synchronic understanding of the present. Foucault shifted from a historical understanding of discourses called archaeology towards an understanding of how historical understanding of discourses called archaeology. From there, he moved towards an understanding of how the history of the present deploys the hidden conflicts and contexts of our identities. He became more interested in how the individual identities, the conflicts and contexts of our individual identities are created in the history of the present. He became more interested in how contemporary phenomena came to be. He became more interested in how contemporary phenomena came to be and what they are. Instead of looking from the past and coming to the present to see what are the discontinuities that are at work there, that is more like archaeology. Coming from the past to the present to look at what are the discontinuities at work here. Instead of that, he moved to genealogy, where history is understood as a means of critically engaging with the present. No need of looking at the past. Here, he looks at the discontinuities of the present to understand how the human being is created. Is that clear? This is more about the past. This is about the present. Even when we read Shakespeare today, or when we talk about 19th or 18th centuries, we are actually in a way talking about the present, aren't we? Even when we talk about the past, we are actually talking about the present. See, when you talk about your grandparents, you are actually talking about yourself. Because that past has become the present. It is the present that matters. The history of the present does not denote talking about the past or how the present developed from the past. Rather, it is a critical engagement with the present. History of the present is a critical engagement with the present. Is that clear? The phrase history of the present was first used in Discipline and Punish. This is the book where he moved from archaeology to genealogy. This book marked the end of Foucault's archaeological approach. What Foucault does in Discipline and Punish is to genealogically disturb the conceptions that we have of the past and present. He genealogically disturbs our ideas of past and present and helps us bring about a change in our perceptions. He helps us to see in a different way. Genealogically, he helps us to see in a different way. He helps us to change our existing perceptions of the past. He helps us to change our existing perceptions of the past and present. Genealogically, he helps us to negotiate with our ideas of past and present in a new way. Clear? In this book, he genealogically changes our perceptions of the past and present. Genealogy is a method of writing critical history, a critical history of the present. Genealogy is a method of writing the critical history of the present. That means what? A way of using historical materials to revalue the past. To revalue the present. You don't use the word past. Genealogy is a method of rewriting history. It's a method of a critical writing of history of the present. Genealogy is a way of using historical materials to revalue the present, to redefine the values of the present. Genealogy is about revaluing the present. Genealogical analysis traces how contemporary practices and institutions emerged out of specific struggles. Genealogical analysis traces how contemporary practices and institutions emerged out of specific struggles. How present institutions, present day prison, for example, how it emerged out of specific struggles. How the present emerged out of struggles and conflicts. Hello, do not go back to the past to look at these struggles and conflicts, but here, in the present itself. The struggles and conflicts not in the past, but in the present itself. And it studies the institutions and practices of the present. The present institutions and practices that we value and take for granted. It studies. But actually, these practices are more problematic and more dangerous than they otherwise appear. He shows genealogically that when you look at the present, you understand that these present institutions and values that we take for granted are actually very dangerous. For example, in the present time, there are institutions like the prison or legality or psychiatry or gynecology that we take for granted. We don't question them. We think science is okay, science is good. We think psychiatry is good. We think prisons are good. But actually they are dangerous. They contain dangerous ways of subjugating us. They contain dangerous ways of, controlling us, manipulating us. I'll give you an example. Before I give you the example, remember, discipline and punish. From archaeology to genealogy. There is no continuous development. Before I come to this, Gayatri Spivak, let me give you that example. Gayatri Spivak has written a book about 3 classic women's texts. 3 women's texts. She talks about 3 novels, Jane Eyre, Wide Sargasso and Frankenstein. She studies these novels and shows how these texts show feminist ideas. They are certainly prototypical feminist texts. They show feminist ideas, but they also engage in what she calls worlding. These texts also engage in worlding. What is worlding? Worlding is the process by which texts disguise imperialism. Worlding is the process by which novels or texts disguise imperialism. They actually contain imperialist ideas, but they don't show it outright. They disguise it and normalize imperialist ideas. Worlding is the process by which imperialist ideas are normalized. Jane Eyre, for example, shows St. John Rivers proposing to Jane and asking her to be a missionary's wife in India. What is the missionary doing in India? That the text is silent about. The text talks about missionary work in India as if it is normal, as if it is okay. That is worlding, disguising imperialist ideas and smuggling them into the text. Foucault says that similarly, there are contemporary perceptions of sexual liberation. Contemporary perceptions of sexual liberation. It looks like we are a sexually liberated society. We think women have found liberation. Women have the right to do whatever they want. They can engage in free sexuality. But Foucault is saying that there is a problem even in sexual liberation or sexual rebellion. There is a problem. Why? The problem is that it centralizes sexuality. As long as sexuality is centralized, it is oppressive. There is no liberation. As long as sexuality remains a very big issue, you cannot be liberated. So Foucault is showing that institutions and ideas that we take for granted today are sometimes more problematic and dangerous than they seem. Foucault says we have to question everything using the genealogical approach. So once again, let me repeat, the aim of genealogy is not only to look at the origins or history like archaeology did, or how things came into being from the past. That is not what genealogy looks at. Foucault and Nietzsche, both of them, were aware that there is no continuous development. There is no continuous development in any discourse. There is no use studying the past because there is no such development towards what is present. You just examine the present. That is what genealogical approach is. If you examine the development of a present discourse, you don't see a continuous development there. Foucault and Nietzsche were both aware of this. The idea of genealogy is therefore not to search for the origins, but to search for the processes of how things came into being. Not to search for the origins, but to search for the processes that are present day processes. The idea is to trace the erratic and discontinuous process by which the present came into being. That is called history of the present. So, genealogy goes hand in hand with history of the present. Now I can go on to this picture. Let me explain with the concept of India, the genealogical approach to India. I have deliberately chosen the picture of a flag that is not unified and perfect or complete. It is the picture of the Indian flag that is incomplete. It is an Indian flag that is in the process of becoming. This shows how the present is in a state of becoming. how the erratic and discontinuous processes of the present are taking place. You will understand if you think like this. Look at all the communal problems in India. Look at the corruption, the mismanagement of affairs in politics. Look at the society. Look at all the people's struggles. India is not a unified society. There is so much happening in India that divides the people. So many inequalities, so many attempts for rebellion from the part of the disadvantaged people. The women, the gender minorities, the underprivileged classes, certain communities, they are all trying to rebel. They are trying to subvert mainstream ideas and practices. They are trying to question established ideas and institutions. So many times. They are trying to assert their power and identity, these silenced margins. How can you say India is a unified whole then? I'm not being an anti-nationalist, I'm just saying an example here of any nation. Any nation is not unified. And look at the changes happening in economics and education, for example. So many disruptive changes happening within the country. Disruptive politics, which is completely taking apart what is existing and creating something new out of it. This is the present condition of India, genealogically. The present is discontinuous and emerging at this moment. The present is emerging at this moment. Did you understand? That is the history of the present. That is the genealogical approach. So in Discipline and Punish, Foucault is talking about the history of the present. Looking at the discipline of criminality and idea of discipline itself. And here he uses the theory of panopticism or Panopticon of Jeremy Bentham. He uses the theory of Panopticon and he looks at how modern prisons function. He looks at how modern prisons function. Panopticon is originally a circular prison, envisaged by the 17th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. You might know that already. Jeremy Bentham conceived a circular prison that controls the prisoners not by physical force but by constant surveillance. Modern prisons do not beat people in the same way as they did in the medieval past. Modern prisons do not cut off people's arms. Modern prisons do not ask them to dip their hands in boiling oil. They do not hang people upside down. Modern prisons function in very clever ways, in very developed ways, using technology, using all sorts of new techniques of surveillance. Modern prisons torture people in more effective ways, more cruel ways, in very developed, sophisticated ways, using technology, using all sorts of oppressive measures. I've given here the picture of Guantanamo prison, where the American government, according to media, has done a lot of atrocities to prisoners. I don't know for sure by anything. Everything I'm reading from somewhere. Americans have done atrocities to prisoners, sometimes without even trial. The prison is like the Panopticon, where prisoners are under constant surveillance, subjugating them to obedience. A related term is carceral archipelago. Carceral archipelago, what does that mean? Anybody? It means a group of islands that form a prison. Carceral archipelago is the term that Foucault used for the surveillance systems and technologies used by the carceral state or prison state. All the surveillance systems and technologies used by the carceral state or prison state to control the people. That is denoted by Foucault as carceral archipelago. All the technologies used by the states or the prison state to control the people. The disciplinary state, according to Foucault, functions like a panopticon. The disciplinary state functions like a panopticon, subjecting people to constant surveillance and control. A very good example to understand panopticon would be the social, legal, and medical norms that have emerged in the contemporary period as a means of regulating people's lives. A very good example is to know how the government is putting you under surveillance is to look at the social, legal, medical norms of the contemporary period that regulate our lives. What medicine, for example, what medicine tells us about our bodies is not always objective truth. Foucault views medicine very differently. For us, medicine is like God's word. We don't question the doctor. Foucault does. Foucault believes that there are social norms, legal norms, medical norms that are taken for granted, that regulate women's health, sexuality, childbirth, shape and appearance of the body, and so on, which are ultimately ways of manipulating and controlling our bodies and identities. What medicine tells us about sexuality or childbirth or menstruation, etc., are ultimately means of controlling us, manipulating us, not necessarily objective truths. Instead of seeing sexual liberation as a very positive, unified, empowering thing, Foucault regards liberatory processes in our society as products of an apparatus of power knowledge. Foucault regards these liberatory processes, sexual liberation, for example, as a product of power knowledge, as a product of the apparatus of power knowledge. Apparatus. Foucault's word for apparatus of power knowledge, apparatus, is dispositive. What does that mean? Foucault believes that many times what we consider as liberation is a result of oppressive power knowledge apparatuses or dispositives working upon us. What we consider as liberation is a result of dispositives working upon us. Look at Guantanamo prison. We believe in justice. We believe in the absolute truth of justice, but justice is the result of oppressive power knowledge apparatuses or dispositives. A dispositive, what is that apparatus? I will come to that presently. So liberation does not work in a panoptic state. In a carceral archipelago or panoptic state, there is no liberation possible. We believe, let me explain the idea with gender issues. We believe in certain things, for example, regarding women's sexuality. We believe that women should not have more than 2 children. It is unhealthy to have more than 2 children. One woman should have only one partner, and with that partner, she should have sex. That is very important for health. She should maintain her feminine hygiene in certain ways, and things like that. These are all sanctioned by medicine. All these ideas are actually apparatuses of power knowledge. All these ideas are apparatuses of power knowledge that are in the process of formation, that are in the process of expansion every day, every moment. Every day, every moment, these apparatuses of power are at work. Did you understand? Every day, these apparatuses are forming and giving rise to ideas that control us. These ideas or dispositives normalize our beliefs, and these dispositives or apparatuses of power knowledge normalize our ideas. It is normal to believe all these things. Thus, sexuality becomes a discourse that somehow becomes constitutive of ourselves and identities and somehow subjugates us. Sexuality becomes a discourse that subjugates us. Foucault believed that when the LGBTIQ people regard sexuality as constitutive of their identity, it is liberating. But at the same time, according to Foucault, it is also a product of the power knowledge apparatus. Did you understand? All our accepted notions, taken for granted notions, are actually products of power knowledge apparatus. Now, Foucault's diagnostic account of our contemporary experience of sexuality involves the specification of an apparatus of regulation. Foucault's diagnostic account of our contemporary experience of sexuality involves the specification of an apparatus or apparatus of regulation. What do you mean by that? Foucault says that in our contemporary understanding of sexuality, we have to think about how our sexuality is regulated by the dispositives. How our sexuality is regulated. And the second thing we have to think about is how we have to identify a historically specific problematization of how sex came to be regarded as a kind of problem for authorities at certain times. You didn't understand. The second thing we have to think about is how we came to identify, we came to realize the problematization of sex as by the authorities. Sex became a problem that should be controlled. For example, when the LGBTIQ people wanted to liberate themselves and voice themselves, what did the mainstream society do at first? The mainstream society looked upon it as a problem that should be solved. The LGBTIQ people were silenced by the mainstream society at first. The mainstream society regarded sexuality as something to be regulated, as something that is a problem. Clear? So, the idea of dispositive means that the physical mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms, the administrative mechanisms, the organizational mechanisms, as well as the power knowledge structures that maintain and enhance power in our society, all these are called dispositive. So Foucault shows through this idea of dispositive all the mechanisms that maintain and enhance power and shows how power knowledge works through them. The idea of dispositive means all the mechanisms, the physical, institutional, organizational, the knowledge structures, everything that enhances power. In lunatic asylums or prisons or schools or even in literature, in literary theory, education, computers, cell phones, in all these things, dispositives or power knowledge structures or apparatuses are exerting power upon us. Power knowledge apparatuses or dispositives are working on us through lunatic asylums, prisons, schools, literature, cell phones. Clear? Foucault also talks about biopolitics and biopower, two terms. It is in the history of sexuality. There is a chapter called The Will to Knowledge. In the history of sexuality, there is a chapter called The Will to Knowledge. That is where Foucault talks about biopolitics. Biopolitics refers to the complicated mechanisms of human life processes being managed by the regimes of authority. How the complicated mechanisms of the life processes are managed by the regimes of authority. What do you mean by that? How gynecology or psychiatry manages our life processes. How gynecology or psychiatry manages our life processes. It is about in what complicated ways our bodies and its processes are managed by the mainstream authorities. That is called biopolitics. The authorities are managing our bodies and its processes. Biopower is about how human beings are controlled through disciplinary power. How controlling of human beings works through disciplinary power, like the Panopticon. How controlling of us human beings works through disciplinary power. And within disciplinary power, we have the docile body and the protesting body, two terms. The docile body and the protesting body. What is docile body? The docile body is that in which power works easily. The docile body is that in which power works easily. And the protesting body is what? The protesting body is the body which protests against power. Clear? Docile body, power works on it. Protesting body protests against it. Now the concepts of power knowledge, biopolitics, biopower, these are all important in understanding the concept of governmentality. Wait. What is governmentality? It refers to the act of ruling, the organized set of practices used by governments to rule over people. The organized set of practices used by governments to rule over people. That is called governmentality. That actually brings us to the current discussion on Foucault. But before I wind up this session, because I showed you this cockfighting picture anyway, let me quickly introduce you to an idea propounded by Clifford Geertz called thick description. Clifford Geertz used the example of Balinese cockfighting to explain thick description. In Bali, cockfighting is a very famous sport, and Geertz talked about cockfighting as an example of thick description. Thick description means a description of human social action, like cockfighting. Any human social action like cockfighting, interpreted not as just physical behavior or sport, but interpreted in terms of its context. Human action, not just as physical behavior, but in the context. All these people, their experiences, everything comes into this sport. That is called thick description. In this thick description, human action should be interpreted in a larger, deeper human sense, in a deeper social sense. A thick description adds a record of subjective explanations and meanings. Subjective explanations and meanings provided by the people engaged in the behavior. All these people involved are adding meanings to what is called a thick description of cockfighting. All these people's subjective experiences are brought into thick description of cockfighting. Clifford Geertz used this idea to show his own practice of ethnography. What is ethnography? A methodology that influenced New Historicism a lot. Here you are looking at social events in the entirety of all the people engaged in that social action. Why Clifford Geertz introduced this term is because in anthropology generally, the anthropologist will come and look at something like cockfighting and reduce this social event to superficial observations. He will just make cursory observations. He will not even look at the other people involved and all their experiences. This is logos. This is a creature. All these people, their experiences, when you take it into consideration, that becomes a creature. Just this event is logos. Are you following? Geertz asserted that a culture can never be fully understood by looking at an isolated cultural event or logos, but a culture should be understood in a web of meanings. A culture should be understood as a web of meanings, like a creature it is. Okay, that brings us to the end of this discussion on Foucault. The next video will be on cultural materialism. I hope you enjoyed this one.